if you want your Irish language learning journey to be sustainable, it needs to be enjoyable and satisfying. And what does that mean? It does need you to be focused and taking on challenges and pushing your skills. Hi, this is Owen. Welcome to episode 87 of the Bitesize Irish Podcast. So I was reading a book called Good Business. It's by Michal Csikszentmihalyi. He's originally from, I believe, the Czech Republic, a psychologist who spent his adulthood in the United States. And he's written about this mental state called flow. And it comes from his own research. I heard an interview with him, actually. It was interesting. He was interested in psychology, and he went to a talk in Zurich once upon a time, and he didn't know who was presenting, but it was something about UFOs at the time. And the speaker was presenting his case, saying, well, these UFOs are really manifestations. These sightings are manifestations mentally of people projecting up to the sky. And it turned out that this presenter was Carl Jung, a psychologist back in the day. So a very interesting guy. So Michal, he saw adults when he was young, after World War II, where their lives had just fallen apart, and some had managed to thrive, and some just fell apart. They didn't know what to do. They didn't have their jobs anymore. They were struggling even probably to find food and shelter. And this intrigued him, and I guess to a very core level in his being, he was wondering what produces happiness. When are people content or not? So he's he led research, or has led research in that resulted in this concept of flow. It's a mental state. It involves focus, and flow, and it only happens when you're equally pushing yourself. You're being challenged, and that you're using up your skills, your current skill set. So it means that if you're feeling bored, he contends that if you're feeling bored, you're probably not using your skills enough, and you're probably not being challenged enough. So even for me, just in my normal workday, this helped me. He gives a map in his book of everyday feelings, emotions. And even for me as a software developer, it was interesting for me to see this map, because it helped me kind of map out my feelings that I can feel throughout the day. And it made me reflect and go, well, maybe I'm not challenging myself enough in these certain parts of the day. And yeah, we all need to take a rest. You can't be concentrating for 8 hours a day. So you go through kind of phases of different types of work and focus during the day. Now, how does this apply to the Irish language learning? Well, I was reading, as it happens, page 42. So 42 is always the answer, isn't it? And it's a chapter in Michal's book called Happiness in Action. And he asks, what does flow look like? And he sets out a couple of kind of markers or pointers to help us understand how flow looks like. In one way, to help realize when you are there yourself, because indeed you do reach flow, you just don't realize it by that name. Maybe when you're just immersed in something, completely focused, that time just runs by. And there was a very specific part that I'm going to read out to you. It's 3 paragraphs I'm going to read now. And the specific point is that when you're in flow, goals are clear. For a person to become deeply involved in any activity, it is essential that he know precisely what tasks he must accomplish moment by moment. For instance, What involves the rock climber is not the ultimate goal of reaching the top of the mountain, but the immediate task of making the next move without falling. The goal that keeps the chess player concentrated is not winning the game, but achieving the most strategic position with the next move or series of moves. A mother gets totally absorbed in reading with her daughter, not because she is concerned that her daughter will be well educated, but because they are together, and she wants to respond to every turn of her daughter's body and mind. Of course, the ultimate goals of these activities, such as reaching the summit, winning the game, and getting a child to love reading, are also important, but true enjoyment comes from the steps one takes toward attaining a goal, not from actually reaching it. People often miss the opportunity to enjoy what they do because they focus all their attention on the outcome, rather than savouring the steps along the way. Where does the pleasure in singing come from? Finishing the song or producing each note or phrase? Do we appreciate a fine dinner because we feel full at its end, or because each bite has tasted good? Isn't negotiating a business deal more satisfying than signing it? In my book, Winning the Language Battle, I've written that it is important to focus on the outcome, that you really should visualize yourself. What do you want your life to look like once you've achieved, say, this dangerous word called fluency in the Irish language? But then you use that tension between your vision and reality to push you towards that goal. And Michał's focus is to tell us, hey, don't dwell too long in that far-off vision. For me, I would contend that you need that feeling of someplace that you're going to give you the initial motivation. But I absolutely agree with Michał when he's saying that moment by moment you should be choosing to do things that will give you enjoyment. So if just the plain example, sitting down and studying the Irish language out of a book for an hour, to me that does not sound exciting. And to you, maybe your brain is tickled enough to do that, but it's just something that would not motivate me. So what would motivate me? Watching a TV show and trying to pick out words and even write down words that I recognize, listening to the radio, even recording myself saying hello on video and posting it on Facebook and YouTube. Those are challenges that take a bit of courage, but they're the steps that really propel you forward. Another example is plucking up the courage to go to language classes. For example, if there's an immersion weekend somewhere in your locality, plucking up the courage to go to one of them and really pushing your skills. So I hope that's been food for thought for you. I hope you enjoyed that little reading from the book. It's called Good Business by Michaly Csikszentmihalyi. And he's also written a more popular book called Flow. Now, on to the second part of this podcast episode, where we feature a question that came in on the podcast, and this is Shinjon.
Hi Owen, how are you? I'm an absolute beginner of Irish language and I'm following your audio program. I'm at the lesson where you talk about numbers and I noticed that some words will undergo mutations based on what kind of words they're neighbor with. My question is, I think in order to properly pronounce that word when we count things, you have to know how a word is spelled in order for it to undergo the correct mutation. Uh, and then it's less of a question about language than it is about the Irish history and society structure. I assume, like many countries, Irish in the old times, Irish farmers or carpenters and people of similar occupations had little access to education. So I assume not everybody knew how to spell the written language of Irish. So how do they keep the language alive if how does it speak the language if they don't know how it's spelled?
Well, thanks so much, Shizong. I asked him, does he have a connection with Ireland or what got him interested? And he replied to say that he's interested in the deeply meaningful cultures of the world. He doesn't have any Irish heritage directly. So I found this intriguing in itself. The question itself is very intriguing. I love the question. I'll break it down a little logically. Let's start with a little history. I looked this up on Wikipedia. So the Irish language, it was written down, it started to be written down in the 3rd and 4th centuries through Ogham. And Ogham is the markings or carvings on the edges of rocks. We're using a simplified alphabet based on Latin, as far as I know. And it was used to inscribe, say, people's names, possibly on their tombs. So there was some concept of phonetically writing out the Irish language in the 3rd and 4th centuries. And then Wikipedia tells me that by the 6th century, after conversion to Christianity, or parts of conversion to Christianity in Ireland, I'm not sure, that the Irish language started to appear as inscriptions, like on the margins of books, like as notes, which is intriguing. And then it was written like full on out in books, religious books. So what am I trying to get to? So by the 3rd and 4th century, Shizong, do you think that the Irish language featured grammar? So indeed it did. Of course it did. Any language inherently has grammar. It has a structure that its speakers use to convey meaning. It's like an agreed understanding. The next question I would have, did the Irish language have intricate grammatical features by the 3rd and 4th centuries? And indeed it did. To say that the Irish language somehow became more complex between the 3rd and 4th century and today, I don't believe that that's the case. I could be wrong. There could be absolutely some grammatical features that have changed since then. But to say that the Irish language has exponentially increased in complexity because people started writing it down, I don't think that's the case. So, the assumption in your question is an interesting one, but I don't think it's true. I don't think that you need to know a written language. You don't need to know how to write a language to know its grammar. So I asked myself, how did these people have this, such a sense of grammar? For example, they would speak in their village without probably any mistakes. They'd put the shevu and the uru, these word mutations in the Irish language, right in the right place, absolutely every single time. And by intuition, they knew what was right or wrong, which way to use a word. And I find that unbelievable because I went through, 13 years of Irish language schooling. Irish language, it was my first language. I speak it every day with my sons. And I certainly speak a simplified form of the Irish language where I'm not inflecting properly every word according to our established grammatical rules. So I asked myself then, how did people even achieve this intricateness of language? And I think the answer lies somewhere, first of all, in intuition. Have we lost this level of intuition that people had? But that's not fair, because there are speakers of languages across the globe who intricately speak their language. They inherently know the details of their language. Grammar in the end is a way to convey meaning. it's not there to make your life harder. And for me, it always is a nice eye-opener when you realise why grammar is there in the first place. It's there for a reason, and it's not there to make your life harder. It's there to help you convey what you want to express to the other people who you're speaking with. So I think in this globalized world where people are communicating, obviously across thousands of kilometers, we've got news channels and the internet and the whole thing, global travel. I think this globalized world, in a way, is a force against language complexity. I see that with the Irish language. Like, there are so many people who speak the Irish language and it's not even their first language, and they carry the Irish language forward in new forms. There are like grammatical forms that are not being used in their speech, but they're still speaking the Irish language and they're still immersed in it. So Shizung, thanks for your question. My simple answer is that no, you don't need to know how to write a language in order to speak it correctly grammatically. It's more about immersing yourself in the language. However, as adult learners, I guess at some stage we do need to study these rules. For me, the reason to study rules like these is to pick up the patterns. And it's not enough for me just to realize that there's a pattern there in the language. I need to write it down, make diagrams, arrows, put it down on paper. And I think that would help a lot of people too. So if you're actively learning the Irish language, have a pen and paper beside you. And you can always take notes on your computer later. But I find pen and paper to be a very powerful tool when you're learning a language. I wrote a blog post before called Creating is Learning. And the idea is that if you're creating something like your own understanding of a pattern, your own table on a page, that just by going through these actions, you're making the language a deeper part of yourself. So if you want to ask your question for the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. What you do is go to www.bitesize.irish/podcast, and there's a big button there to record your question for the podcast. And you can do so on your phone, your computer. Try to have your question written out if you can, so you have an idea of what you're asking directly, and be in a quiet place if possible. And this is your part to be, your time to be part of the podcast. It's the listener questions that really spark my energy in the podcast. And obviously there are many more listeners of the podcast than people who record a question. So it's your chance to be part of this podcast, to really make an impression on the podcast. So thanks for listening, and don't forget, I have a book called Winning the Language Battle, and it's about things like making the language journey sustainable. So you can find that on bitesize.irish too. Okay, slán tamil, bye.